So I'd like you to welcome you all to the 26th seminar, Nauman, that's absolutely fantastic, of the International PhD in Progress Seminar Series. This is phase 3 of the series that's been organised by the Global South Network. And I do want to start the session by thanking Dr. Nauman Rayat, the lecturer in law at Leicester Law School, who's also the founder and convener of the Global South Network, who's organised this series and was at the helm of phase 1 and phase 2 as well, and fantastic work it is. So I'm Diane Levine. I'm assistant professor at the School of Criminology, Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leicester. My own research is focused on understanding the ways in which children, adolescents, emerging adults survive and thrive when life is very challenging, and in relation to topics like child abuse and neglect and child maltreatment and child protection. I'm joined by my colleague, Priscilla Vitoh, who's a University of Leicester School of Law lecturer. Her research focuses on advancing economic growth and stability for minority groups in emerging economies, so very relevant to today's talk, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Her research interests encompass bank financing, gender studies, international development, international economic law, and global political economy. She has prior experience as a relationship manager in corporate and retail banking, specialising in maritime banking and small and medium-scale enterprises lending. Priscilla combines practical knowledge with an interdisciplinary approach and does fantastic work. So I hope you'll enjoy the comments that she's able to share with us, because Priscilla's commitment really extends beyond research to influencing policies that promote greater minority representation and participation in national and international economic and trade systems, including organisations such as the World Trade Organization. Our peer commentator for the session today is Chengeto Kazangarare, who is a PhD candidate at the Leicester Law School, and who'll be offering perspectives after the talk. And absolutely last but not least, our guest speaker for today's session is Emilia Oris-onyiri, PhD candidate, School of Law, University of Nottingham. Emilia's research lies in international trade, finance and economic law, and she obtained her Bachelor of Laws First Class and a Master of Laws degree in financial and commercial law from the University of Central Lancashire. Emilia is a qualified barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria, where she practiced advocacy in civil, corporate, financial and commercial law disputes before starting her doctoral research at the University of Nottingham. Emilia is also a certified mediator and arbitrator, a member of the Nigerian Bar Association and a member of the Nigerian Institute of Chartered Arbitrators. Today, Emilia will present their project titled The Economic Community of West African States, Navigating the Barriers to Trade Liberalization and Integration. Emilia, super looking forward to this. You have 30 to 35 minutes for your presentation, which will be followed by 5 minutes for comments and questions from the discussant and the peer commentator, and hopefully a little bit of time as well for questions and answers by attendees. I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for making all the time to attend and participate in my presentation today. So as earlier introduced, my name is Emilia and I'm a second-year doctoral researcher at the University of Nottingham. And the title of my research is The Economic Community of West African States, Ecowas, Navigating the Barriers to Trade Liberalization and Integration. I'm happy to move on to the next slide.
Yes, it's there.
It's not reflecting on my end.
It seems to have changed on ours, Emilia. So this is the slide that has introduction at the top. I hope that helps.
Yeah,
yes, yes, it is. Right. So just by way of introduction, my research is centered around African integration. So I would say that it's Afrocentric in nature, as it focuses on concepts which are key to the research, concepts such as regional integration and Pan-Africanism. So they are actually at the core of the research. In very simple terms, regional integration is a method whereby two or more countries, either within a geographical region or outside a geographical region, come together to harmonize common trade policies and, in some instances, fiscal and economic policies as well, in order to attain some level of integration or unity amongst themselves. Now, Pan-Africanism, on the other end, is an ideology of oneness that is heralded by the African people, and this includes the African people on the African continent, as well as the African people in the diaspora, to come together, develop the African people, as well as develop the African continent. So ECOWAS, which is the focus of the research, is a 15-member states regional economic community in West Africa, and it's actually the predominant regional economic community in West Africa. However, I'd love to say that the current membership of ECOWAS is being threatened to be reduced to 12. And here on my slide, I have highlighted 3 countries, which are Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And these countries have been highlighted because towards the end of last year, they indicated an interest to leave the community as there's been some military coups in the country, and all 3 countries are desirous of forming their own form of integration. Nothing has been put on paper yet, as there are still speculations around whether or not the membership of the community will reduce to 12, or whether there'll be some internal negotiations between the member states, ECOWAS, as well as the 3 member states which are threatening to leave. So the community was founded in 1975 for a number of reasons, but for the purposes of my research, I'll be highlighting that it was founded to bring about economic development amongst the member states by the member states deepening their trade and economic policies. So I'm happy to move on to the next slide. Yes, so on this slide, I have just given an insight into what regional integration as well as what Pan-Africanism mean. So I wouldn't need to go into further details in explaining both terms, as I've covered that earlier. So I'll be happy to move on to the next slide, if that's okay. Yes, so what's the significance of this research? Well, there are a number of reasons why I have embarked on this research. The core being that Africa, or West Africa, despite being blessed with a number of natural resources, happens to be the lowest contributor to global trade. And in the most recent times, global trade is expanding sporadically as countries are being open or more open to being interdependent with each other. Countries are being more open to fostering their trade and economic ties by trading with each other. And at the moment, Europe, Asia, the North America, and South America have higher trade levels compared to Africa. So I'm looking to delve into the reasons why there is this slow pace or low level of trade contribution to global trade, not just in ECOWAS, but by expansion, the African continent as a whole. And another significance of the research is that there are 8 regional economic communities in Africa as recognized by the World Trade Organization, and ECOWAS happens to be the oldest of these regional economic communities, as it was founded in 1975 via the Treaty of Lagos. However, over 40 years later, some of the aims and objectives or the goals of the community, which were set out at the time of its integration, are yet to be achieved. Very little strides have been achieved, especially in the area of trade. So we have seen some level of integration or some level of advancement in integration as it relates to the free movement of people across ECOWAS. However, there is also a limitation to the free movement of people across the ECOWAS member states, as citizens of each member state have a 90-day stay rule without the requirement of a visa in other member states. However, if they have to stay for more than 90 days, they would have to apply for an extension of their leave in that particular member state. So while there is some level of integration when it comes to the free movement of people, the community still has a lot of developments to do in that area. Now, in comparison, the level of trade integration or the level of trade liberalization amongst the ECOWAS member states is very minimal. Now, there are a number of factors which contribute to, which I have termed in my research as barriers. There are a number of barriers or factors which contribute to this slow-paced integration in the area of trade. And I'll be delving into some of these barriers, and I've categorized them into two. So I have the tariff barriers, which relate to the payment of taxes on goods, which are moving from one member state to another member state. And then there are non-tariff barriers, which relate to other administrative limitations that comes with the free movement of goods from one member state to another member state. So as earlier mentioned, the barriers, the tariff and non-tariff barriers in ECOWAS are almost unending. And so my research will not be delving into all of the tariff barriers or all of the non-tariff barriers. I'll be focusing on just a few of the tariff and non-tariff barriers which I'll identify, and I'll be giving justifications for why these barriers have been chosen. Another significance of the research is to examine, having identified these barriers, I will be examining how these barriers can be eliminated, if they can be completely eliminated, or in the absence of that, how these barriers can be navigated to address the slow pace of intra-community trade across ECOWAS. I'll also explore what I have termed in my research as a unique compositional intricacy, which is inherent in ECOWAS and plays a contributory role to the slow-paced integration amongst the member states. And what this means is that the 15 member states, as we currently have them in ECOWAS, have very different views or very different approaches to integration. And that can be related to their colonial experiences, as that affects how they view this concept of Pan-Africanism or the concept of regional integration amongst themselves. So the member states have been classed into the Anglophone member states, which are the English-speaking countries, the Lusophone member states, which are the Portuguese-speaking countries, and the Francophone member states, which are the French-speaking countries. So I'll be examining how the colonial experiences of these member states affect the regional integration or trade integration that the community is looking to attain. And finally, I'll be looking at proposing a trade integration model, which would involve an amendment or the enactment of fresh provisions, fresh regulations to govern the intra-trade activities in the community. And hopefully the proposed model for trade integration could be applied to other regional economic communities in Africa. I'm happy to move to the next slide when you're ready. So moving on to the gaps in the current literature as it relates to my area of research. So the slow-paced integration of ECOWAS has been compared very heavily to the integration process or scheme of the European Union. Very little comparison has been done with ECOWAS and other regional economic communities in Africa. I'm of a different opinion or a different view when it comes to this because I believe that, or I'm of the opinion rather, that a comparison between ECOWAS and the European Union is very impractical. And that's because the European Union, understandably, being the most successful form of integration in the world, as it's a continent-wide integration structure, compared to ECOWAS, which is an integration of 15 member states in one region of Africa. Now, there are unique compositional intricacies, as earlier mentioned, in ECOWAS, which are not in the European Union, one of which is colonialism. And so I'm of the opinion that colonialism has a very huge impact on the integration scheme of the African member states or the ECOWAS member states, if I were to narrow it down to just ECOWAS, compared to the European Union. As a result of that, I opt to compare the trade integration scheme of ECOWAS to that of two sister regional economic communities in Africa. And in my research, I have chosen the East African Community, the EAC, and the Southern African Development Community, SADC. Now, the justification for these regional economic communities is that, on record, they happen to be the most advanced regional economic communities in Africa on a holistic level. Albeit, I'll just be comparing the trade integration schemes of the EAC and SADC to that of ECOWAS to see if indeed the EAC and SADC are better integrated in comparison to ECOWAS, and in that case, whether ECOWAS can adopt some structure or adopt a model from the EAC and from SADC that could be applicable to their trade integration. Now, why two regional economic communities in Africa as opposed to one, you may ask? I have chosen the EAC and SADC because, as successful as they've been presented to be, the EAC comprises of 7 member states, which is significantly smaller than, the membership is significantly smaller than that of ECOWAS, which has 15 member states. And the countries or the member states in the EAC have a cultural homogeneity that I believe is absent in ECOWAS. They have a common culture, they have a common language, they have a common heritage. And that's completely absent in ECOWAS. So that could maybe in some way contribute to a faster pace in the trade integration structure or scheme of the community in comparison to ECOWAS. Now, looking at SADC on the other end, SADC has 16 member states in the community, is said on paper to be more advanced in comparison to ECOWAS in its trade integration scheme. And so maybe SADC would be more relatable to ECOWAS in terms of the larger membership. However, my research will examine whether the number of member states in a community as it relates to African integration has any effect or has any impact on the advancement of the trade integration scheme of that community. So that's one gap in the current literature that I'll be addressing. The second gap in the current literature that I'll be addressing, or my research will be addressing rather, is that some of the barriers which impede the advancement of trade integration in ECOWAS have been attributed to other factors, such as the absence of a common language, the absence of a common currency, as well as the absence of a common economic and fiscal policy across all 50 member states. While those factors are recognized as contributory factors to the slow-paced integration of the community, this research will be adopting a different approach in the sense that the research will be looking at the legal provisions, the policies, the laws, the regulations which govern trade integration as well as trade liberalization amongst these member states. Now, any form of regional integration is usually economic or political in nature. So member states come together to advance their economies or to deepen their political ties. However, the structure that makes that integration possible are the laws or the treaties. So if you have effective laws, or an effective treaty, then that would have a very huge impact on the level of integration that the member state or the community as a whole would attain. Of course, that's if there is the applicability or the political will on the part of the member states to uphold the treaty as well as uphold any complementary legal provisions which govern the trade activities within the community. And so my research will be providing a legal perspective to addressing these trade barriers in ECOWAS by looking at the current legal structure, as I opine that the current legal structure in ECOWAS is very ineffective, quite outdated, does not address or incorporate the current issues which impact trade within the community, and that has a very huge impact on the slow-paced integration in ECOWAS. I'm happy to move to the next slide. Next slide.
Just to flag to you, Emilia, you've got about 10 minutes left, okay?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you. So moving on to my methodology, I am adopting 4 methodologies in my research. The first is a doctrinal legal analysis, and just the justification for this methodology is that I will be looking at the laws which govern trade integration in not just ECOWAS, but trade integration in the EAC as well as SADC, and I will be examining and describing these laws to determine how effective they are in propelling the free movement of goods across these communities. I'm also adopting an interdisciplinary or a socio-legal methodology to the research, and that's because, as earlier mentioned, any discussion on regional integration is more historical, more political, or more economic in nature. The legal perspectives to regional integration is very underdeveloped and depends on political science, international relations, economics, fiscal policies, as well as history don't know if I've mentioned that earlier, to build up the laws or to build up the treaties that will enhance the integration goal or integration objective of a community. There is also a law in context, and the justification for this is that I'll be examining the impact or the effect of the current laws that we have in Ecowas, compare that to the proposed amendments of the current laws or proposed enactment of fresh laws to address these trade barriers, and looking at the impact that this would have on not just the economies of the individual member states, but the economy of ECOWAS as a community, as well as the impact on small businesses and larger corporations which are desirous of having a business presence in other member states across the ECOWAS community. And finally, I'm adopting a comparative legal study or comparative legal analysis where I compare the provisions, the laws and the regulations, as well as the treaties which underpin trade integration in the EAC and in SADC to that of ECOWAS. We're moving on to the next slide. So here I have identified some of the barriers that will be examined in the research. And under the tariff barriers, I have export tariffs, import tariffs, as well as transit tariffs. And like I mentioned earlier, this relates to the imposition of taxes on goods that are moving in between countries. I also have some non-tariff barriers, which here are the quota restrictions. So this is a restriction or a limitation on the number of goods that member states can move from their country to other member states. There are also technical and administrative regulations, which are mostly encountered at the borders of member states when goods are moving in between the member states. There are also custom regulations, which are imposed by the customs of each member state when goods are entering into their countries from other member states. And finally, I have sanitary and phytosanitary regulations and certifications. And this is important because ECOWAS doesn't have a common policy that unites the sanitary and phytosanitary regulations in the individual member states. So moving on to the next few slides, I won't be delving too much into the slides as they outline the legal provisions that govern trade integration in ECOWAS, as well as the legal provisions that govern trade integration in the EAC and SADC, which would be the foundation of my comparison across all three communities. So these are the legal provisions for ECOWAS, and I think I must have omitted the legal provisions for the EAC and SADC. So here I have outlined the member states that fall under my analysis of the tripartite colonial experience, where I list each member state according to their colonial experience and their perspective or their approach towards integration in ECOWAS, which I believe is beginning to play out, especially with the intended withdrawal of some member states under the Francophone member states, which are the Republic of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. And there are speculations that the intended withdrawal of these three member states could propel a further withdrawal of other member states, of other Francophone member states, for these member states to form their own integration scheme, integration structure that ousts the English-speaking member states and possibly the Portuguese-speaking member states. So these gives, I have a few more minutes, so I'm just going to quickly run through the East African community and the Southern African Development Community for more context. So the EAC was founded in the year 2000, comprises of 7 partner states, which are the Republic of Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. And on the other hand, we have the Southern African Development Community, founded in 1992, comprises of 16 member states. And as I mentioned earlier, the membership composition of SADC is very similar to that of ECOWAS in terms of numbers. So here I have the legal provisions which govern trade integration in ECOWAS, as well as the legal provisions which govern trade integration in the EAC and SADC. Finally, this is a very minute aspect of my research. It doesn't form the core of the research. However, it's important to mention the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, or the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was established in 2019 with the objective of bringing together, or with the objective of enhancing the free movement of goods across the 55 member states, or the 55 countries in Africa. So at the moment, it has a composition of 54 member states, with the exception of Eritrea, which is not a member state at the moment. And there have been speculations on whether or not AfTA, as it's popularly known as, or whether or not AfTA is intended to be a confederalist structure or a federalist structure where it could or may or may not possibly replace the already existing 8 regional economic communities in Africa, or whether its establishment is to work alongside the already existing 8 regional economic communities in Africa. And in my research, I'll be proposing arguments that the success of AfTA is very dependent on the success of the individual regional economic communities in Africa, of which ECOWAS happens to be one of. And if ECOWAS, alongside the other 7 regional economic communities, are unable to attain a certain level of success in their trade integration scheme or structure, then it'll be very difficult for the free movement of goods across Africa to be made a possibility. On the other hand, if the individual regional economic communities in Africa are able to attain a decent level of success in trading amongst themselves, then it'll be easier for the regional economic communities to open up their borders to other African countries which are not necessarily members of their community, and then this can propel further movement of goods or free movement of goods across the African continent. That is the end of my presentation. Very
Thank you, Emilia.
Summarized in a few slides. I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Emilia. That was a really clear, very well structured, very well framed, walking us through all of the core issues that you'll be addressing in your research. Can I invite Dr. Priscilla to perhaps please share your initial perspectives and thoughts? Is that all right, Priscilla?
Yes, that's all right. Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you very much.
Hi, Emilia. That was quite interesting and very comprehensive. I quite enjoyed listening to that. I felt like I understood your work by listening. So well done.
Thank you.
what I was going to ask about, you mentioned at the end about AFTA, because AFTA is, even though you're saying that AFTA is just a minute component of your work, I think AFTA is very important at this stage because you're talking about regional integration, and what AFTA is trying to do is integrate trade. So I'm not sure that ignoring AFTA and making it a minute part of the work, I think maybe you need to look at it again, because with what AFTA is seeking to do, which is sort of solve the problems that you are looking at in the sense of trade. And I can understand, because during COVID, when Nigeria decided to close its borders, it had a ripple effect on the other countries who take goods to sell from Nigeria or take goods into Nigeria to sell. And so even though trade is such an important aspect of the Ecowas relationship, it's very interesting how that has been ignored. So I think this is very important work you're doing. Well, I would, my other question would be in the sense of comparing ECOWAS. I understand you comparing it to SADC because of the same numbers, but comparing ECOWAS to EAC, which has half the members that ECOWAS has, would the parallels be accurate? Wouldn't it be so different in the sense of, if you have a smaller number, perhaps and you mentioned that with EU, that EU has a bigger region or has more power, but in the sense of comparing lemons and maybe apples, I'm thinking if you have a smaller number like what EAC has, then perhaps they may be more effective because of that small number. That is my something that I wanted to highlight. And then my second highlight, which I think you addressed, but I would encourage you to look at it a bit more, would be with the AFTA. Now I also have another question in the sense of the WTO itself, because I've been doing some work on WTO, and if you look at it, the African countries are not necessarily even engaging with trade on the global platform. So when you look at even the WTO system, the African countries are not even engaging with that. So could that be a reason why our regional integration in sense of trade is suffering? Because as a community, we're not properly engaging on the global international trade system. Could that be a reason why? I don't know the answer, but I'm thinking this is more your area, so perhaps you will tell us in your work. But could that be why our regional integration is not really at par? Is it because we just as a community, we are not interested in engaging together with trade? Could that be the underlying? Because I know that you're looking at you're using the social legal aspect of, you're looking at a social legal perspective. So perhaps is there a social element to this of not wanting to engage either on the international platform, which then trickles down to the regional platform? And with all, you have a lot of theories that you're working with in different perspectives. I'm interested to see how are you intending to marry it, because they seem a lot. You're doing social legal, you're doing empirical work, you're doing other things. How is this going to be married so that it is coherent and that it has one voice? I think my time is up, but yeah, very interesting and very important work you're doing. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Priscilla.
Thank you, Priscilla. Emilia, do you want to respond to Priscilla's points, or shall I invite Chengeto to go first? What would be easier for you?
I think I can quickly address some of the issues that
Fabulous.
Dr. Priscilla
Thank you.
I have
Great.
some noted. I hope I'm able to address most of them. So starting with AFTA, I do agree that AFTA at the moment is very topical because of its intention to open up the borders of all the African countries and enhance the free movement of trade across these countries. Now, the reason why I'm making AFTA a minute part of my research as opposed to a major part of my research is to avoid a collision between ECOWAS, which is the focus, and AFTA. And I believe that I'm Nigerian, and being an ECOWAS citizen, I believe that the trade policies of ECOWAS affects me directly and affects the citizens of the other ECOWAS countries directly. ECOWAS has been existing for over 40 years, has some very good goals or some very good plans in terms of how advanced it wants to go in its trade integration scheme and structure. So I think it's more practical to see what the issues are or what the barriers or limitations which are impeding 15 countries from trading effectively amongst themselves, as opposed to a 55 or a continent-wide integration scheme that would be very wide. And you know, with a PhD research, I have to try and narrow down my research focus as much as I can. I mean, I am interested in the after structure and the after goal, but I believe that I can delve into that on a much larger scale, maybe as a postdoc research, because I have only 100,000 words, you see. Yes, but thank you very much for that contribution. Now, moving on to, I have another question. I'll take that after Dr. Priscilla's. Moving on to why the EAC and SADC as opposed to choosing one over the other. I think it's very difficult to oust either the EAC or SADC from my comparison, and that's because in terms of general integration and even trade integration, the EAC is more advanced. And so if you're going to compare something that's not as great to something else, you have to compare it to the more advanced option, which would be the EAC. But then the EAC has a smaller composition, as earlier mentioned, has a cultural homogeneity, a common language, which is Swahili, across most of the member states, which is absent in ECOWAS. So maybe the smaller composition of the EAC could be the contributory factor to their more advanced trade integration, or maybe not. Now, moving on to SADC, SADC is quite similar to ECOWAS in its membership composition because 16 member states, very different cultures, very different languages. I mean, the SADC countries or the SADC member states have more of a cultural homogeneity in comparison to ECOWAS. But then it happens to be more advanced, especially in trade as well as general integration than ECOWAS. So I think what I'm doing is trying to pick up bits and bobs and see what would work best, not just for ECOWAS, but what could work best for even the countries that I'm using as my comparators and the other countries or the other regional, sorry, not the countries, the communities that I'm using as my comparators, as well as the other regional communities in Africa. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, it's a very good response. You should note it down just in case this comes in your Viva.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think you'll be glad this has been recorded because, you know, what you're demonstrating there is the ability to show that you've thought about these things. So I think that was nicely done. Before we get to the questions in the chat, would it be possible to invite Chengeto to perhaps offer their perspectives as peer commentator?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Emilia, for your presentation. I thought that was quite interesting and that it addresses a significant issue. I also feel that this is timely and a relevant topic given the ongoing efforts to enhance regional trade in Africa. I also found that the focus on both tariff and tariff barriers provides a comprehensive view of the challenges facing Ecowas. But however, I was wondering if you have considered exploring non-economic barriers such as cultural and political. This is because I think while the focus on economic barriers is crucial, being from Africa myself, I've noticed that culture and politics plays a significant role in commerce in Africa in general. So being that your research is interdisciplinary, I think it would be interesting if you explored cultural and political factors that impede integration, as this could provide a more comprehensive understanding of the challenges. And also this would align with the interdisciplinary approach. I also feel that the presentation references key aspects of regional integration and Pan-Africanism, and I found that this was good because it grounds the research in relevant theoretical frameworks, and this helps in contextualizing the study within broader scholarly debates. Overall, I also think your research has the potential to provide impactful and actionable insights for enhancing trade and liberalization integration in West Africa. So yeah, well done.
Thank you very much, Chengeto. I hope I pronounced your name rightly. I pronounced your name right.
It's Chengeto.
Chengeto.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
Very
fantastic.
Thank you.
I think that's all super useful, and I think the points about culture are really well made. I think both Priscilla and Chengeto have suggested that perhaps some thoughts around where you place the boundaries around homogeneity versus heterogeneity around these groups. You know, how, given that you're doing empirical work as well, actually, how do you say whether something is homogeneous or heterogeneous? I think that would be something that you might want to reflect on a bit in the dissertation, just to tick off a box, you know, with the examiners. Shall we turn to the questions in the chat? Oh, sorry.
I just want to correct a notion. I think it's been mentioned twice. So I'm not conducting any empirical research or empirical study, yes, for my research. And that's because I have some barriers to conducting an empirical study. Time limitations or time constraints being at the helm of it. I'm already in my second year. I have barely 2 more years to go or 1 more year to go. And so conducting an empirical study would entail maybe some form of physical presence in some of the countries, access to legal documents as well could also be a barrier, because as an outsider, how do I gain access to some of the records that show the actual level of trade across the member states? And there are also cost issues because I'm comparing 3 different regions now. So if I have to do any form of empirical study, I have to incorporate in some way all 3 regions. And security issues as well. There are security issues to conducting this sort of research, as an empirical study would entail conducting maybe some interviews with high standards in the communities, as well as maybe observations at the borders of the member states. So I do intend to further this research beyond my PhD and especially conduct an empirical study, but that's intended to be as a postdoc research.
Again, that's beautifully explained, absolutely crystal clear, and very, very sensible justifications. I think if you wanted to ask for example, ethical approval to travel somewhere like Niger at the moment, you might have quite a challenging time getting that approval.
Yes, I will.
If we could turn perhaps to the chat then, there are 2 questions, well, there are 3 questions really. The first is around how does the role of the Ecowas Parliament resolve some of the legal challenges that are located in the community, the West African community?
So this is a very interesting question, because in contrast, unlike the EU Parliament, which makes laws, the Ecowas Parliament doesn't make laws. And so the role of the ECOWAS Parliament to addressing these barriers through the amendments or through the amendment of current legal provisions for trade or enactment of fresh provisions for trade is very minimal. So honestly, 100,000 words or 80,000 words is really small to encompass the challenges that impede the free movement of goods in ECOWAS. And that's because ECOWAS, the structure of ECOWAS has been patterned after that of the EU without necessarily incorporating or having recourse to the intricacies of the member states that are coming together to integrate. So we have the ECOWAS Parliament, they don't make laws, the Parliament doesn't make laws, so their role to addressing this issue is very minimal.
Fantastic, thank you. I suppose that also goes some way to answering the second question is, how would your model propose to resolve things like the unexpected withdrawal of Mali, for example, or yeah?
So that's quite interesting. I'm not sure how far the proposal would go in terms of maybe limiting the withdrawal of countries or the withdrawal of member states, because any form of membership, any form of international membership, countries are free to withdraw at any point if they feel the need to. I mean, we have that with Brexit, with the UK leaving the EU, even though there are speculations again that the UK is intending to rejoin the European Union. So the proposal is to address the trade barriers, have laws that actually help the free movement of goods, because some of the laws that we have in ECOWAS are very restrictive, or some impose taxes on some classes of goods, but exempt taxes on other classes of goods or other categories of goods. So the proposal for a model is to address the barriers, the trade barriers for the current member states, but not necessarily for the member states that are intending to leave, because you can't restrain member states from leaving an international membership or an international treaty.
That's fantastic, thank you. Obet Mawadze, yours was the next question on the list. Do you feel that Emilia has already addressed that a little in her response to Priscilla, or would you like to expand slightly on your question? Oh, I hope they're still here. Perhaps. Okay, I think we'll move on to Bright Chimedza, if that's okay. I'm so sorry, it feels like I suspect our visitors had to go. But Bright, would you be willing to ask your question next?
Thanks, Levin. Yeah, you correctly pronounced the name. That's the correct way. To Emilia, I think there's a part when you talked about that you indicated that your study is not empirical.
Yes.
And I think it also involves it's not really it's a broadened field if I look at it, which means one will be searching for novelty, one will be searching for nuance, and probably one will be expecting one to exhume exclusive findings that can enrich the study. So in that instance, how then are you going to, do you intend to come up with exclusive findings if you're not doing an empirical research? And what is it that's significant that you would show? Because if it's not empirical, well, it's just a question. If it's not empirical, you might likely be reproducing work that has been done by other people and just be taking like it's a book review or something like that. So I'm trying to understand the exclusive findings, if it's something of interest to you, and if it is, how then are you going to establish that? Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for that question. So I do agree that a study of this nature is very empirical, or should be empirical. However, I have to be realistic with the possibility or the feasibility of conducting an empirical study within 3 years, cost implications, time constraints, security issues, as well as access to classified documents. So as a result of that, I can't conduct an empirical study because that would frustrate the research. So I will be making new findings. I'm taking a very different perspective or a different approach on 2 bases. The first being that the barriers to trade integration in ECOWAS, which have been previously identified, have been attributed to political, economic, language, or even cultural barriers. So those issues have been very developed compared to looking at the laws which bind or the laws which make it possible for integration to take place or for trade integration to take place. So at this point, I don't necessarily feel the need to delve further into things that have had a decent level of discussion or a decent level of research, analysis, developments, you know, as we may call them. I'm looking at the laws. How can we better structure the current laws and regulations which underpin the trade integration in ECOWAS? And that's simply because a lot of these laws are very outdated, not specific, very vague. And so it leaves room for very different interpretations by not just the member states, but even individuals and companies that rely on these laws to conduct trade in other countries. And so the barriers to trade integration or the barriers to regional integration as a whole in ECOWAS is multidimensional. So I'm choosing to focus on the legal perspectives, which is very underdeveloped, very, very underdeveloped in comparison to the current research, which looks at, you know, the issue of a common language, political will. Of course, political will is at the center of everything when it comes to integration in not just ECOWAS, but Africa as a whole. Cultural diversity. I think as important as those factors or as important as those barriers are, even if those barriers are resolved, with ineffective laws, there'll be no free movement of goods across the ECOWAS community. I don't know if that answers or addresses your question.
Thank you, Emilia. I'm so sorry, everybody, but we're 1 minute over, and I know how strict Nauman gets. We have to finish on time and start on time. So I'm going to be very rude and say thank you very, very much to Emilia, to Dr. Priscilla and Chengeto for your contributions. We look forward to our next speaker next week, and yeah, wish you all the very best with the work as you progress with it, Emilia. I'm sure there'll be a fabulous section in your thesis that says starts with the heading contribution. It will be there, I'm sure. Thank you, everybody. Be well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.